and welcome to Nana's Crafty Home. My name is Tanya. Today's tutorial is going to show you how to join squares with single crochet. I am using this technique to join my Easter blanket squares that you can find. They are all free patterns on my blog. I will have a link below in the description for you if you would like to check out these fun spring Easter themed squares. The single crochet join method is a very easy, beginner-friendly way to join your crochet squares. You can join your granny squares, you can join solid squares. You can choose to have the single crochet portion of your join showing on the front side of your work, or you can have the single crochet portion on the back side of your work. They are going to look different. This is the front side, the side of my single crochet, and you can see that it's creating a ridge. There is a ridge here, and that is visible. It almost frames your squares, especially if you're using a different color from the outside edges of your squares. You can see on the back side of my squares here, it creates almost like a whip stitch appearance, and if my squares were the same color and I was using the same color of yarn to join the two squares, that would virtually be invisible. Let's go ahead and get started. So I have my yarn on my hook, and I'm using the same weight yarn, the same kind of yarn for my joining as what I used for my squares, as well as the same size crochet hook. For both of those, I am using Red Heart with Love in various colors for my squares, and I'm using a size I or a 5.5 millimeter crochet hook. So you're first going to want to decide, do I want my single crochet ridge showing on the right side of my blanket or not? Once you've made that decision, you're going to decide on the placement of your squares, and you're going to begin joining your squares horizontally across. I'm at my first squares for a horizontal row of squares. So this is my first square in the bottom right corner. This is the square that goes above it, and I'm going to be working across in this direction and then joining squares as I join through these first two. So since I've decided that my single crochet ridge is going to be showing on the right side of my squares, I'm going to want the wrong side of my squares facing each other, so back to back here, with the right sides facing out of your squares. If I were working this from the back side of my square, I would have it in the opposite way. The right sides would be together and the wrong sides would be facing out. So I'm going to join my yarn in that chain 2 corner space at the edge in order to begin. If you didn't have a chain space, you would work in the stitches along that edge, and you would want to start in the very middle corner stitch of that square. So I have now joined in that front square, and I'm going to be referring to these squares as the front and the back square. The front square is the square that's facing me. The back square is the one on the back side or the furthest from me. So I'm going to insert my hook back into that chain space, and I'm going to insert my hook in the chain space of that back square, and I'm going to work a single crochet. Now, you could decide that you wanted to work your single crochet in different loops. You can see here the top of my stitches from the last round of each of these squares. There are the top 2 loops from each stitch. So there's a total of 4 loops. You could go ahead and work through all 4 loops, so you'd be working a single crochet stitch by inserting your hook in that first stitch under both loops, and then inserting it under both loops of the next stitch of the back square and working a single crochet stitch. This does create a bulky join. So if you were working this from the back side and you didn't want that bulky join, you may decide that you want to just work through one loop of each stitch of both squares. And you can do that in one of two ways. You can work in the inner loops, which would be the back loop of the front square, so inserting your hook under that back loop, and then the inner loop of that back square, which is the front loop facing you. And then you would work a single crochet. You could also decide to work in the outer loops of your stitches. So I could insert my hook under the front loop of the front square and the front loop, which is actually the back loop facing you, of that back square, and then finishing a single crochet stitch. This creates a less bulky join in both of those situations, and particularly recommended if you're going to be working your single crochet join from the back side of your project. For my project, I'm going to be working single crochet stitches under both loops of both squares. Very simple and easy. So insert your hook under both loops of that next stitch. So this is that stitch right next to your chain 2 corner space. Then insert that hook underneath the first stitch of the back square. So this is the stitch right next to that chain 2 corner space. Insert your hook in that stitch and complete a single crochet. And this is so easy. We're just working single crochet stitches under both loops of both squares in each stitch across. So inserting our hook into that next stitch of both squares, so you'll have 4 loops on the top of your hook, and then completing a single crochet stitch. And just continue working that all the way through this edge of your squares. You want to make sure that your tension is nice and loose. You don't want to be working these stitches more tightly than you would have for the squares themselves, because that will bunch your squares. You want to keep a nice even tension throughout the join. And just continue working your single crochet stitches all along that edge to your corner. And you can see how that looks. So we have a nice defined ridge here. So I'm at the next corner space, and I'm going to work a single crochet stitch into that chain 2 corner space, and I'm going to bring in my next 2 squares that I'm going to be joining. So I've brought in my next 2 squares. You want to make sure that those squares are facing the right direction. So I have my right sides facing out, wrong sides together, and I have my chain 2 corner space. I'm going to work a single crochet in the chain 2 corner space of both of those squares together. And then I'm just going to be repeating the same sequence in that next stitch of both squares, working a single crochet, and work a single crochet stitch across the edges of both of those squares, working all the way down that row. And let's take a look at how that corner appears. So you can see I've worked across these 2 squares through my chain 2 corner space of those squares, and then went on into the next chain 2 corner space of the next squares. And I will then, when I have all of my squares joined horizontally across, I will then come back and work the join vertically for all of the squares. If you are working a solid square, so you don't have a chain space in the corners, you would just work through the middle stitch of those squares. So just continue on working single crochet stitches through both edges of your squares, working through your corner, and then adding any squares in the same manner, just repeating those same steps for the entire horizontal row. For my situation, I'm going to have a total of 3 squares across, so I'm going to have another set of squares to join. So once I've completed joining all these squares, I'm then going to be working another set of squares on top of these. So I'm going to repeat those same steps, bringing in another square on top of this one, joining in the corner, working across, and adding squares throughout, repeating that for any horizontal rows that I'm going to be adding to my project. So I've completed joining all of my squares across, working horizontally, and now I'm coming back through to join my squares vertically from top to bottom. And I started in my corners just as I did when I was working horizontally, working through those edges of those 2 squares until I get to the corner. And you can see here, this is my horizontal join for these 4 squares, creating this corner here. And I'm now at the corner of these 2 squares. I've worked through every stitch of these 2 squares. I'm going to place a single crochet stitch in that chain 2 corner space. I'm going to skip over that ridge, so that horizontal join, that single crochet ridge, and I'm going to work a single crochet in the chain 2 corner space of the next 2 squares. And then continue on working single crochets in every stitch. So let's take a look at that corner join of those 4 squares. So you can see that I worked those single crochets over that ridge, but it didn't create any additional bulk because the only thing over that ridge are the 2 loops from that single crochet that I worked in the next chain 2 corner space. So very clean and professional looking, and it doesn't add a lot of bulk. Very easy. So you're just going to continue on working that same join, single crocheting in every stitch to the next corner, and then repeat the corner instructions and do that for every vertical row. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial today. Thanks so much for joining me. As always, remember to subscribe to my YouTube channel so you never miss a new video. Thanks everyone. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.